All through 2021, we covered some of media's biggest screw-ups here at Rising, analyzing coverage of the year's biggest stories, including COVID disinformation, the downfalls of both former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and former CNN anchor Chris Cuomo, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's floundering approval ratings, Hunter Biden and his emails, the January 6th Capitol breach, and big tech's blackout of former President Donald Trump.
Here to reflect on how the media covered 2021 and if they've learned any lessons in time for 2022 is Katie Halper. She's the host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. Katie, good to see you and Happy New Year.
Thanks. You guys too.
So how do you think the media handled, this year was the first in several where Donald Trump didn't, there was less reason for him to command the news cycle. Maybe you could argue that he still did to some extent. But how do you think the media handled him this year?
Well, it was nice to have some time off from the constant, the walls are closing in narrative that the media invested so much time into. I always think it's interesting what they chose to focus on when it came to Donald Trump. It seemed to be the one thing that really did not matter and would not matter to people who didn't already hate him, which I think reflects the kind of circular, insular nature of so much of the media. They talk about things that they find important and that their dinner parties find important, but other people don't. So it was nice to have a break from that constant narrative. The walls are closing in. This is it. He lost the election, obviously, but all the theories about the things that were going to take him down obviously never came to fruition. So I miss that kind of amusingly tone-deaf and monotonous kind of hum. I don't really miss it. It was just a funny thing to watch. Then there's also, it's been a while since, I'm just thinking back, we also had, of course, a nonstop vilification of Bernie Sanders, which has toned down a little bit. So those are two things that we're not dealing with as much anymore. But I still think that the media, of course, is managing to focus on all the wrong things, get upset about all the wrong things, be apathetic or even encouraging about the things that they should be up in arms about. And that's probably one of the biggest themes I think we see is, with the exception of Joe Biden's position or pulling out of Afghanistan, with that exception, I think we're seeing a lot of media hypocrisy, surprise, surprise, but the media being the media being okay with things when Biden does them, that they would be up in arms about if Trump had done them. One example off the top of my head recently is, I think, the CDC announcement to cut the isolation time in half. Of course, coincidentally, right after Delta, the CEO of Delta writes the CDC a letter encouraging them to cut the time in half, offering to work with the CDC. I mean, what's really pathetic and scary about this, I talked about this on my show last night with two doctors on the Katie Halper Show, but they're actually not even implementing the recommendations of the CDC, which encourage testing. So they're actually being less cautious. They're not even implementing the suggestion of the Freudian slip, since the CDC and the CEO of Delta seem to be working hand in hand. But the CEO of Delta had recommendations that were more cautious than what the CDC is doing. But can you imagine if under Trump, they divided the number of days that you were going to isolate?
It would have been an experiment in human sacrifice. It would have been the exact.
It would have been.
Right?
It would have been non-science. It would have been, I can't believe we have this person playing with people's lives. I mean, I happen to think that, but I just think it applies to Biden in this case.
Right, and to your point, so Chris Hayes apparently on his show last night, I saw this on Twitter just now, he said, so on the Omicron wave, the risk went from something we hadn't really dealt with before in our lifetimes to something that looks more like the flu. The flu can still be dangerous, but we do not reorient our lives around the flu. How many months have I been saying that? So it's so funny that now you're allowed to say that if you're a liberal media person.
Did Chris say that, or did Fauci say that?
No, Chris Hayes said that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, again, and what's interesting is that you and I probably disagree on this, but we agree on the double standard about it, right? Like,
yes. Yes.
And what's fascinating is that there really isn't the science to back it up. And to their credit, I mean, this is a weird thing to say, but at least they're being like honest in their dishonesty. So we have Fauci and Walensky basically saying this is a business decision, not a science-based decision. The CDC didn't come out with their science briefings, which they usually do when they come out with a new decision. I saw Libby Watson tweeted about that. She was at some CDC webinar where they gave some very incoherent answer about why that was. But there really isn't that much new science. They don't have the data to even look at it. But they're at least admitting, I think Fauci referred to it as like the structure of society and not wanting to disrupt that too much, which is, I guess somewhat more honest than pretending that there's a scientific reason to do what they're doing.
Yeah.
Katie, I'm curious if you think that conservative media in 2021 has been as harsh to Biden as liberal media was in, let's say, 2020 to Trump.
I think in some ways, that's a good question. It would be hard for me to isolate because you'd have to isolate for how deserved it is. And that's a hard thing, to control for if we're doing an experiment. I actually think maybe Biden's what's funny is that Trump's gaffes should have spoken for themselves. Biden's gaffes also speak for themselves. That is a really good question. I mean, they seem to be almost standing back and letting him gaff it up more than the liberal media did with Trump, where they would kind of pounce on it more. But what do you think?
I think you could kind of look at also just if you focus in on the children, on the aspect of the children. So Donald Trump with Ivanka and Eric and Donald Jr. And you look at then, for example, with Biden and Hunter and even his daughter's diary, right? So the emails, Hunter Biden's emails and his daughter's diary, how much coverage did that get? Did those storylines get in comparison to had it been Ivanka's diary and had it been Donald Jr.'s emails?
Right. Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, I think to me, obviously, it's very clear in the mainstream to liberal media that there was no discussion of those things. I do think that there was a discussion among right-wing media, though, of the Biden.
I think right-wing media has been pretty harsh to Biden, but it's more boring because Biden is boring. Like Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, makes a compelling villain in a story. He's literally a TV celebrity. He's a compelling figure who inspires intense feelings and who people want to discuss. Joe Biden, whether you love him or hate him, is just boring. He's just he can be bad in a normal kind of way, and this is very frustrating for the media because it's not nearly as fun for them to cover him and talk about him, regardless of what their position on him is. So right-wing media, everyone in the media, this was their worst case scenario: is Biden being the nominee and then being the president? Because what will they do? What will they talk about? Because audiences don't care as much about Biden. So right-wing media, I think, has tried to find tried to raise up other more compelling villains over the last year because Biden just doesn't get people excited. Biden is a communist Marxist taking over society.
Right.
No one believes. Their heart's not in it. You know what I mean? So it's frustrating, I think.
Well, I think they tried to do it with the Hunter Biden thing, but I think part of it is that it just got no traction in any media outside of the right-wing media.
Yeah.
So it just wasn't amplified at all. So it was just a fringe thing, right? They did try to focus on the Hunter Biden thing.
Right. They tried to find a salacious element of that, and it's good they covered that story. But at the end of the day, the problem with that story was this does make Hunter Biden look very bad, but Hunter Biden is not the president, right? How can we?
Yeah, and there wasn't that much that they could rope. There was a little bit of corruption, right? Potential corruption, but it certainly wasn't the slam dunk case that it was with Trump and his kids.
Right.
With his kids, which was huge. I do think though that I almost feel like they're just sitting back more also because they're letting Biden is doing so badly in the polls, and the irony is that they don't even have to do that much work because the liberal media has been so terrible to Biden about Afghanistan. The one good thing that he's done. I mean, he's done some good things in my opinion, but the thing that I think that is most uniquely good about Biden so far is finally kind of acknowledging that it was such a word I can't say show in Afghanistan for 20 years, something that no other president really dealt with or admitted, and that should have been something, of course, that was praised by the media, especially the media that claimed to say that, everything was disaster under Trump, but there's no coherence, or it's not principled at all. It's totally partisan. And then I think the other big story about the media's failures, of course, and I know this is something you guys talk about, which makes you unique, is Assange. I mean, the silence about the Assange case is probably one of the biggest miscarriages of media justice, which matches the miscarriage of actual justice that we're seeing around Assange. And I think that's going to go down in history as just a very dark chapter of complicity, of ignoring one of the biggest stories of free speech, the biggest stories of freedom of press. I think that, I don't know what journalists are doing, that they don't think that this could come and bite them in the butt. To my liberal friends out there, you should listen to Daniel Ellsberg, right? Daniel Ellsberg is a hero to you guys. He thinks that Assange should be free. He thinks this is a miscarriage of justice. He's horrified by this. To my liberal friends out there who liked Obama, just a reminder, Obama decided not to indict Assange, and Obama, yes. And what Biden is doing is Biden is departing from Obama's policy, and he's actually continuing Trump's policy. So I don't know what Merrick Garland and Biden are doing just in terms of optics. They get away with it because the media doesn't cover it, so the optics are never even in view. But anyone who likes Obama should be horrified that Biden is taking this Trumpian route with Assange. And it's unbelievable that does anyone talk about the fact that the guy had a stroke?
Yeah.
Like, where do you hear? That's barely covered at all.
No,
this guy's been locked up.
I don't even think it was Trump's policy necessarily. I think it was the people around him. I don't think he cared either way.
Yeah, Pompeo. Pompeo really cared.
People around him, they were like, yeah, let's go for this. And they basically allowed, I think in a lot of ways, for Trump, who didn't care about a lot of issues, those around him, the establishment, decided to take advantage of that. And it's only helped Biden because he's like, great, somebody else did the dirty work. And now I get to do what I would have done anyway. But I couldn't, because the optics are bad. So now I just continue.
The New York Times, because the New York Times problem, which Obama had the kind of like awareness to recognize as a problem, which is that if you're going to go after Assange for this, you're going to have to go after the New York Times, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, El País, all the places that, obviously for Obama, it would have just been the New York Times, the Washington Post, because those are in the United States. But, it's really shameful. And Pompeo was like, and as we know, the fact that this wasn't front page news, that we know the CIA discussed kidnapping and killing Assange, the fact that that wasn't front page news, the fact that it wasn't front page news that the security firm hired to cover the Ecuadorian embassy in England went through the garbage and went through the baby's diapers to try to see if he was the father. The fact that the lead witness in the hacking case against Assange admitted to lying, and is a convicted sex offender, embezzler, who's been diagnosed as a sociopath. And the media is silent on this. If the media did its job, I think the Justice Department would have to, out of sheer embarrassment, drop the case. I don't get how you can pursue a case based on the perjury of a sociopath. That already is such a bad look.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely shameful. So we hope for more coverage of Julian Assange, and we hope there'll be positive news to report on in the new year. Katie, thank you so much for joining us. We got to leave it there, but we wish you a happy new year, and we're happy to have you here.
Bye.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.